Welcome to my first How to Paint tutorial, how to paint Lady Olinda, the Mortarch of Grief. I'm going to walk you through how to paint this miniature from priming till completion. Once your model is assembled like mine is, you're ready to begin the painting process. We'll be priming using a technique called zenithal highlighting. We can do it in a couple of ways, notably with an airbrush and with white, grey and black spray. We'll use the second one for this tutorial. The purpose of this technique is to give you a bit more contrast with your miniature with a smaller amount of effort than you would when you're using a paintbrush. Just note that depending upon the temperature and the weather in your climate, Corax white spray can tend to have a powdery finish. That'll clog up detail. I'd recommend you warm your can under warm, not hot water, and give it a good shake for about 2 minutes, just like the can says to. You can also test it on a model that you might not mind losing just to ensure that you get the finish you desire. And if that fails, and you still want a zenithal highlight, I recommend that you wait until the temperature and humidity are more acceptable, or get an airbrush. Begin by priming your entire miniature in Chaos Black, then you can leave it to dry for about 10 to 15 minutes before adding the next spray. However, if you aren't interested in zenithal highlighting, then you can skip to the next 2 steps, and simply move on to base coating. Just wait till your primer dries first. Now that you've primed your entire miniature black and it has time to dry, you can simply spray it again with Mechanica Standard Grey Spray. Do this from about a 60-degree angle. Again, allow your miniature to dry for about 10 to 15 minutes. Finally, prime your miniature for a third time with Corax White Spray. Do it this time from a 45-degree angle so you're only catching the areas that will be illuminated by an overhead light. Now that your miniature has been primed, we're going to move on to painting base coats and through to layers on the cloak, and the cloaks on the 2 banshees that hang off the Lady Olinda's side. We're going to start that by doing a base coat of Celestra Grey. We're then going to wash that down with a very thin down mix of the Fang, and then we're going to highlight that back up with Phoenician Grey, and then a further highlight with Phoenician Grey and White Scar, and a final highlight of White Scar. We'll then glaze that with a watered down consistency of Sotek green, and then highlight it again, maybe with a dry brush, of White Scar again. Celestra Grey is dry now, so we're going to move on to a wash with the Fang. So get some on your palette and thin it down with water or Lahmian medium. Don't get too much on your brush, otherwise it will pool, and if you mess with it after it does, it'll cause coffee stains. You don't want that. I had some occur on this miniature, but I managed to work around that by not playing with them too much and evening it out with highlighting and rebase coating afterwards. Now that the Fang has dried, we're going to layer over it with Fenrisian Grey. Stay to the raised areas. You can be a little bit more heavy-handed with this layer because you want to build that layer consistency over the next 2 of further layers. This layer will be very, very subtle, so when we move up to the next layer, you'll start to see the build of colour come through. So this is a 1-to-1 mix, 1 paintbrush to 1 paintbrush of Fenrisian Grey to White Scar. Same as before, stay to the raised areas. Be a bit more precise this time around, though if you get a little bit extra you can just wipe it off with the thumb, as long as you're quick. Alright, this is coming along nicely. So now we're going to move on to a white scar highlight. Same as before, sticking to the most raised areas. Once this layer has had time to dry, we're going to move on to a glaze. So get some Sotek green on your brush and thin it right down on the palette. Get a little bit on your brush and glaze it over the top of those layers to tint the color to more towards that blue-green spectrum of color. Don't let it pool in the recesses, this is not a wash. As you can see, it's starting to tint the color overall of my miniature's gown. Now that that's had time to dry, we can move on to the final stage, or you can leave it here. I'm choosing to go further and do a dry brush of white scar. Now that that's done, we're going to move on to painting the bone colour underneath the veil for this miniature. We're going to do that with a Sharptie bone, wash it down with Seraphim Sepia, and then highlight it with a mix of a Sharptie bone and Screaming Skull. Now that that's dried, we're going to move on to the wash of Seraphim Sepia. Allow it to get in between the cracks and creases where the hair seems to fork away from each other. Now while we wait for that shade to dry, we're going to paint the gold. So we're going to start with a base coat of Retributor armor, wash it again with Seraphim Sepia just like we did with the bone, and a highlight this time, a 1-to-1 mix. I do love 1-to-1 mixes of Retributor armor and Liberator gold. Now the shade is dried on the bone, we're going to go over it with the 1-to-1 mix of a Sharptie bone and Screaming Skull. Now we're going to shade over the gold with Seraphim Sepia, all over the same areas you painted the Retributor armor the first time. Now, while we wait for the gold to dry, we're going to move on to painting the dark black hair on both of the banshees that are with the lady. We're going to do that with a 1-to-1 mix of Abaddon Black and Dawnstone to have a dark grey colour. After that, we'll layer it with Dawnstone. You can be fairly heavy-handed because we're going to wash it down with Nuln Oil to make it have more of a blended feel. After the initial mix is dry, what you can move on to is highlighting with Dawnstone. Go heavy-handed if you want to, because you're just going to Nuln Oil wash it back down in just a moment. Before we move on to the final stage for the hair, we're going to go back and paint the highlight on the gold. So we're going to use Retributor Armor and Liberator Gold in a 1-to-1 mix, focusing on the areas where a light would catch from the top. Back to the hair, we're going to go over the whole area with a wash of Nuln Oil. On the right hand side, one of the Mirmorn Banshees is clutching a wooden box. It's a nice red brown, so we're going to paint that with a 2-to-1 mix of Khorne Red and Rhinox Hide as a base coat. Next up, we're going to start working on the areas on the front of that same chest and on the hourglass that will soon be a blue metallic color. So get Leadbelcher on your brush and start painting it over the lock and key areas on the chest and then over the hourglass section of the hourglass. Once you've done that, you want to move on to a highlight. So we're going to use a Stormhost Silver highlight over the most bright areas where the light would be catching on the hourglass, and again on the same areas on the chest. So the time's come to paint the rose vines all over the lady. What we're going to do is paint that with a 1-to-1 mix of Caliban Green and Abaddon Black to give it a nice dark green colour. We'll then do a dry brush over the whole thing with Warpstone Glow and a further dry brush of Moot Green. You can be kind of heavy with this dry brush of Warpstone Glow. It's a very weak colour, so it won't show up very much, so if you get a nice build up of the colour, it'll look better. While that dries, I decided that I wanted to get a bit more white over the lady's face, so what I did was a glaze of white scar by watering it down nicely and painting it thinly over the veil. For the flowers, I used a 1-to-1 Khorne Red and Abaddon Black color for the base color, which I seem to have missed in this video. Apologies for that. However, then you can do a highlight with Khorne Red on its own, and you can do some washes with Druchii Violet and maybe Carroburg Crimson and Drakenhof Nightshade to give those flowers a different look if you'd like. Finally, we move on to the last part of the miniature, the base. I'm going to do a texture paint over the bottom with astrogranite debris, and then I'm going to dry brush that with Terminatus stone. That will give it a nice sandy effect. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope to make many more. Remember to like, share, and subscribe.